will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, the season I am steeling myself for is primary season. It doesn't matter that the Iowa caucuses are not until February. We are already in it, my friends. The sound bites, the horse race polling, the debates with their countless contenders, the Fox News scandal of the week, and the Donald. You cannot forget the Donald. I'm always so conflicted at this time of year. As a responsible citizen and even as a pastor who attempts to be relevant, I feel it's important to tune into the political conversations. I actually think they matter. Politics at its most noble is the process by which we create communities that lift up our highest values. Politics is how we decide to live together, and I can't imagine anything more important than that. My problem is that every year, ignoring all past evidence, every year, I hope this time will be different. This time, the issues will count. This time, we'll get past the name-calling. This time, we'll forget about money and put people first. This time, we'll actually listen to each other. But the early showings are not promising. I was reflecting on the sorry state of American politics when I read James's letter. We don't often hear from James. Most often we hear from Paul, whose epistles inspired most of the doctrine that became formal Christianity. Nope, James is more of an outlier to Christian thought, which is interesting, because the James we are talking about is actually the brother of Jesus. Unlike Paul, he's the one who had the flesh and blood relationship with him. He's the one who walked with him and ate with him and cried with him and helped him in his ministry, stood at the foot of the cross. For James, Jesus wasn't just a spiritual, theoretical relationship. He was a hands-on, physical one, which might be why the faith he describes in this letter feels so visceral, so human, so rooted in action. James has little patience for a faith that leads with its head. For him, the point of following Jesus is never to debate doctrine. It's not to think about faith. It's to live it. For James, the point of faith is not to get information about Jesus, but transformation through him. His central question for us is this: how has Jesus' life, death, and resurrection changed our lives? Because Jesus lived, how do we live differently? As I reflected on this letter, I was struck by two answers to this question. And initially, they seemed to contradict each other. So first, James is talking to us about slowing down and listening, forgetting about impressing each other and being right all the time, and focus more on understanding each other, on really hearing each other. And the second thing that leapt out for me is that James is telling us we must not just be hearers of the word, but doers. It's not enough to listen to the gospel. He says we have to act on it. So which is it, James, I wondered? Listening well or doing well? But of course, like any great wisdom teacher, James sees no contradiction here. For James, these two concepts come from the same place. They both begin in a place of embodiment, where the love of God shows up in a real and tangible way in our daily, ordinary human lives together, in what we do, in how we treat each other, how we listen for God in each other. I believe that James is telling us that when it comes to living out the gospel, we need to get out of our own heads and open our hearts and get our hands dirty. We need to step beyond the world of ideas where we think ourselves into faith, and to quote the old Nike ad campaign, just do it. And for a lot of us, that's an inconvenient stretch. Often we prefer to see religion as a world of inspiring ideas. And we like that because ideas can be safe. Endless theological debates can delude us into thinking that we are actually being faithful. It's a way of keeping the status quo intact. But James challenges that notion. He tells us that God's outrageous love, the love that showed up in Jesus, has actually changed the game on the ground for us. The status quo is done. Business as usual is over. No more petty jealousies, no more competitive faith, no more hypocrisy. If we dare to call ourselves Christians, he says, we have to change the way we relate to each other. We have to stop speaking before we listen. Stop being so angry about everything, and stop hiding behind our faith to keep the status quo. James has a particular problem with a lip service religion that doesn't make a difference in the world. He asks us, what good does it do to sit here in church on a Sunday and then ignore our neighbors the rest of the week? What good does it do to listen to prayers and offer prayers if we never open our hearts enough to listen to the hopes and fears of the people we work with? If our faith is just a Sunday faith, if its focus is in thinking right and believing right and doesn't change anything in the world outside these doors, then James tells us it's pretty meaningless. It was all of this talk about anger and empty words that caught my attention in this political season. Because I don't know if I can remember an election cycle that has been marked by so much noisy anger, so much hate-filled judgment and knee-jerk condemnation. We are living in a time of enormous change, of seismic social and economic and environmental shifts that have serious consequences for our world and the people in it. We are living in a time where technology and communications can bring us ever closer, but is also moving us farther and farther apart. These issues are complicated and layered, and we all have a stake in getting them right. So why are we plugging our ears and yelling at each other? Why do we so often default to the same tired business as usual approach? We pay lip service to the need for change, and then we sit on our hands. We debate things endlessly and still talk past each other. We stoke each other's anger. We shout each other down, and we let fear have the last word. Instead of working for meaningful change, we too often just share an angry post on Facebook. We can blame our politicians for creating this toxic atmosphere, but if we weren't so willing to follow, they wouldn't be leading. And as folks who strive to follow Jesus, much more is asked of us. We are asked, to quote Gandhi, to be the change we want to see, or in the case of Jesus, to be the love we want to see. In the realm of politics, that is called political activism. In the realm of faith, it's called sacred activism, putting our actions where our faith is, letting God's love show up in what we do. Now that sounds very direct, very simple, and frankly it is. Simple, but very hard. Because it's so much easier just to hear about the love or talk about the love or argue about the love than it is to be the love. That involves time and risk and courage. That might cost us something. But listen to James and breathe a minute. He's not telling us that we need to eradicate hunger or end war or eliminate poverty overnight. He's not telling us that we need to quit our day jobs and join the Peace Corps. He is telling us that big changes can start with small things. He tells us that simply listening to each other more and speaking less and tamping down our anger can go a long way toward change. He says worrying less about getting the doctrines right and more about living right can transform the world. I love how theologian and pastor Eugene Peterson translates James' words in his Bible translation called The Message. He writes, "Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle along in the rear. God's righteousness doesn't grow from human anger. And don't fool yourself into thinking that you are a listener when you are anything but, letting the word go in one ear and out the other. Act on what you hear. Those who hear and don't act are like those who glance in the mirror, walk away, and 2 minutes later have no idea who they are or what they look like. Anyone who sets himself up as religious by talking a good game is self-deceived. That kind of religion is hot air and only hot air. Real religion, the kind that passes muster before God, is this: reach out to the homeless and loveless in their plight, and guard against corruption from the godless world. James is calling us to this kind of hands-on faith, a faith that listens deeply to God's word and then takes action. He says that that's the only way we can really show God that we have been listening. And this was Jesus' mandate too. Despite a popular misconception, despite the fact that a whole world religion has sprung up around him, Jesus never asks us to worship him. When people try, he calls them out for it. He only asks us to follow him, to act like him. And he has no patience for those who use religion as a substitute for compassion or justice or mercy. He's uninterested in getting into verbal sparring matches over points of law. He has one law, and it's love. And that law compels him to act. Love is never theoretical. One of the true heroes of this kind of hands-on faith was St. Francis. Rejecting a life of privilege and power, he lived a faith of small but powerful actions. At a time when being on the wrong side of a theological debate could cost you your life, Francis rejected sophisticated religion for a life of humble spiritual practice. He found that even the most profound beliefs only come true in the doing of them. Ideas would always be argued about, because thinking is invariably, am I right or am I wrong? It's dualistic thinking, which leads to winners and losers and endless angry debates. Real truth is never found in theory, only in living. Or as Francis would say, you only know as much as you do. As we take our faith outside these doors this week, I invite you also to be doers of this word and not just hearers. Don't leave this message behind when you leave this place. Live it. And as we face into a contentious political season, let's challenge our leaders to do the same. Let's all spend less time arguing about how to live together and how to love each other and more time just doing it. There's a lot at stake for God's world in this. The best ideas will never change us if we aren't willing to live them out. The most sophisticated theology is empty if we don't embody it. We don't need to overthink this, people. We only need to be the love. Amen.